To welcome everyone to day 3 of the wrap-up of the SPIPA Australia project, SPIPA being the Strategic Partnership for Implementation of the Paris Agreement, an initiative funded by the European Commission and the German government, essentially to strengthen collaboration and action in support of climate mitigation and climate response in a bunch of key economies around the world, kind of in partnership with Europe. In the last couple of days, we've had a look back at some fairly major activities that SPIPA has been involved in. And today we're going to pick up a couple of smaller activities that started rather later because we had some resources freed up by the fact that none of us could travel. There are some advantages to a pandemic, if not many. So the first part of today, we'll hear from research activities about the co-benefits of health and about some initiatives around sustainable finance. And in the second part of today, we'll talk about some overall lessons and some ways forward from here, thinking about how to continue the networking activities that we've built. Should have introduced myself in case there's anybody new on. My name is Peter Rayner. I'm the Australian lead for SPIPA Australia. I should also acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. So first, we're going to talk about health co-benefits, and it's a delight to introduce Belle Workman. Belle is a research fellow with Melbourne Climate Futures, and we were really lucky to be able to train her to do some work on what's a really interesting and I think rather underplayed issue of the kind of health co-benefits that can accrue as we start to act on climate change. So these are positive things that emerge as we start to take action. Belle said she's happy to take a Q&A, and we'll handle that at the end. So if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A, and we'll try and pick those up at the end. So that said, Belle, over to you.
Many thanks, Peter, for that very warm and generous introduction. Just double checking that everyone can hear me and there are no issues yet. Fantastic. And thank you also to Win for sharing the slides. So hello all, and thank you for the opportunity to present at the EU Australia Knowledge Network. As Peter has said, my name is Belle Workman, and I'm a research fellow at Melbourne Climate Futures at the university. I was lucky enough to do a PhD in health co-benefits and policy development through the EU Centre on Shared Complex Challenges and the Climate and Energy College a couple of years ago. So I feel privileged to have been able to work on this particular project. I'm presenting today on behalf of Professor Catherine Bowen, who's Deputy Director at Melbourne Climate Futures, and myself. And I'd like to acknowledge that Catherine is the mastermind behind this project, responsible for its conceptualization. And unfortunately couldn't be here today. She's attending IPCC approval processes as a lead author of the Working Group 2 report, which is due for release early next week. I'd also like to apologise in advance if a 5-year-old joins us halfway through the presentation, fingers crossed not, but thank you for your patience and graciousness if she does. Next slide, please, Win. So those of you who know me will know that I generally start my presentations with this slide. And so following on from Peter's introduction, I'd just like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia, in particular the traditional owners of land on which I'm presenting from today, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. In particular, I recognise that Indigenous peoples around the world are priority populations in a changing climate, often disproportionately impacted in numerous and profound ways. I believe there is still much to learn from Indigenous peoples, knowledges and practices, particularly in relation to health and wellbeing impacts of climate change. Next slide, please, Win. So in order to position the project, I'd like to briefly introduce the concept of health co-benefits, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So for the purposes of our project, health co-benefits represent the additional benefits that arise from the implementation of policies that aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to address climate change, which we've referred to as climate mitigation measures. So while health co-benefits of adaptation are incredibly important, for this particular project, we focused on mitigation as opposed to adaptation, primarily because of the increasingly small window for urgent action on climate change. Health co-benefits come in all shapes and sizes, but most often arise from reductions in other harmful emissions, such as air pollutants, as these emissions are often produced by the same sources. They can be achieved through multiple pathways. They can be direct or indirect, physical or mental in nature. They can occur immediately, intermediately, or longer term. They occur across sectors and are often largest in developing countries, where they can partially, if not fully, offset costs associated with implementing mitigation measures. However, they're increasingly important across all countries, given ageing demographics and increasing rates of pre-existing health conditions. Consequently, healthcare benefits can assist policymakers to justify ambitious action on climate change in line with the Paris Agreement. As one example, this infographic demonstrates the healthcare benefits that arise from cleaner air as a result of emissions reduction efforts associated with the energy sector. As you can see, estimated health and climate benefits have been modelled, quantified and monetised, and they actually played an important role in the rationale for implementing energy policies in the US in 2015. Next slide, please, Wing. So there are a number of existing resources and graphics that have been developed historically to communicate the healthcare benefits of climate mitigation measures to various audiences. Two such examples can be seen here: a series on health in the green economy that was developed by the World Health Organization in 2011, and the often cited British Medical Journal graphic from 2016. However, we were unaware of any resources that incorporated the latest available evidence on healthcare benefits across sectors that were developed specifically to support policymakers during the policy development process. To address this gap, we set about creating an accessible, evidence-based summary for policymakers. Next slide, please, Win. So our approach to the project can really be summarised in 5 key steps. First, we completed a targeted review of the peer-reviewed literature on healthcare benefits, and we preferenced more recent examples from the literature that were located in various countries, both developed and developing. We then collated that information, and working with the design team at the University of Melbourne, we designed an initial layout for the SPM. Next, we engaged climate and health experts from across the EU and Australia, including from the World Health Organization and the Institute of Advanced Sustainability Studies. While we're still awaiting feedback from the expert reviewers we approached, feedback will inform revisions to the summary for policymakers before it's finalised in both digital and printable format. We'll then disseminate the resource widely across local, state, national and regional policy and practice networks to policymakers working in climate policy development across sectors. Next slide, please, Win. So this slide presents the current iteration of the summary for policymakers. As you can see, it contains information regarding the types of mitigation measures that can impact health across sectors and select examples from the peer-reviewed literature of estimated health benefits. Further contextual information, along with a reference list, will be included on the reverse side of this infographic. And this information will cover the need to carefully develop mitigation measures that avoid harming health, sometimes referred to as health co-harms or disbenefits, or that increase existing inequities. It will also cover other benefits that arise from implementing climate mitigation measures, as well as some additional research and resource needs that have been identified in the peer-reviewed literature. We've considered the strategies we may need to employ to maximise the impact and reach of the resource, including translating it into other languages in order to increase its global utility. And we'll also explore the potential for further iterations to incorporate feedback specifically from policymakers. Given the importance of reframing the narrative around climate action to one of benefits and opportunities, as opposed to burdens and costs, we're hopeful that the summary for policymakers can act as a useful point of reference during future climate policy development to encourage the consideration and integration of health into cross-sectoral climate policies. Next slide, please, Win. Just to finish off before I take some questions, we're incredibly grateful for the support we've received in order to deliver this project. Specifically, we would like to acknowledge and extend our thanks to the expert reviewers, funders and colleagues who facilitated the development of this resource. And with that, thank you for your time, and I'm very happy to take any questions. Sorry, Win, final slide is just there with my with the MCF email address in case you prefer to email. Just checking the
Fantastic. Thank you
chat.
very much indeed. If there are any questions in the Q&A, Win, if you want to have a look at those, otherwise we can open the floor for any questions.
Yep, just there's one question coming up from Jordan Panayotov. We address climate change because it affects all people around the world, irrespective of geography or the personal characteristics. Therefore, mitigation of climate change, policy actions, investment should have as primarily objective improving health of whole populations, which we talk not, it's more like just a comment. Yep.
I would wholeheartedly, yeah, thank you so much, Jordan. That's a really great point, and I would wholeheartedly agree with you. I think a really interesting project that I would like to undertake would be to actually evaluate all of the different tools, assessment tools that are used to support policy development, whether they be cost-benefit analysis or impact assessments, so that we can actually get a sense of just how extensively health is considered as a primary or integral component of the policy development process. So thank you for your comment, very relevant, and I agree. We should be looking to really embed health. And so certainly that was what my PhD was looking at, and hopefully this resource can be one step as part of encouraging that. You're right, health in all policies is a very useful approach.
Another question from Alan Pierce. How conservative are these estimates of co-benefits?
Yeah, that's a great question, Alan. So I guess this is where my technical expertise is somewhat limited, and I rely on my colleagues who are responsible for the development of those papers as part of that expert peer review process that we're going through. My understanding is that they are very conservative often, because they only consider the benefits that are most easily quantified. So there would be a number of benefits that wouldn't necessarily be captured or incorporated into those estimates. And also, I suppose, being conservative is probably a common approach to modelling scenarios like this. And yeah, certainly something I think that a lot of the modelers they'll acknowledge, obviously, in their studies, the different parameters that they use to address that. So hopefully that answers your question. The long and the short of it is, I think often a conservative approach is taken, and there's often an acknowledgement that the benefits are usually much larger than what is reported in the peer-reviewed literature.
Any other questions? If not, I've got one. Take the chair's privilege.
Yeah, go for it, Peter.
Go for it. It must be tricky with these things to kind of assess the impact that it has. I mean, in some sense, these things are kind of, a lot of the times they miss, and sometimes they're absolute gold, right? It's kind of some infographics and some kind of methods of communication. I don't know, it strike a chord somehow, like writing a hit song or something. And it's really tricky to know how it's worked. Is there anything in sort of methodology that you can see how much it's being used, who's using it for what, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And so in developing or devising the initial resource, we actually looked at successful historical examples, including one that actually had been developed by Catherine at the local level for a local government hearing in Australia.
Yep.
As I mentioned in in terms of next steps and the kind of the implications, one thing I would actually really like to do would be to, as another discrete project, actually evaluate this tool by engaging specifically with policymakers who we know have received it, and actually getting a sense from them of just how useful it is. It's, I think, in terms, you know, we're very much managing our expectations, but hoping that will be a very useful point of reference, as I said, in terms of being a reminder and front of mind, as you know, health needs to be a consideration during those really meaningful conversations and considerations when policy is being developed. But I think it's an excellent question, and measuring impact is something that is really important, but can be really tricky to do. I guess we see this really as, this is one engagement mechanism, and measuring impact would be would need to come as part of an evaluation process.
Might also be interesting for people that kind of work professionally in the science communication area, where most of us think about communication as a mass effort. This is kind of, how do you target specific groups with just the information that they're going to need to leverage? And it's a really interesting, quite a different kind of question, and I think really
very much
quite an interesting research question in its own right.
I wholeheartedly agree, and I will be, yeah, I'm excited to see where this you know, this discrete project ends up springboarding to. So thank you.
Very cool.
Any further questions?
Anything else out there?
I don't see there's any further questions. So.
If not, congratulations. Thanks very much. And also congratulations to your 5-year-old who
thank you.
At least resisted, as far as I can tell.
The TV saved me yet again.
Great. All right. Thanks
everyone.
very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Now we change gears really quite substantially. But again, to think about another aspect of the problem that we were able really to look at. And we're going to talk now a bit about methods of thinking about sustainable finance and how that might look. And we're actually going to, we have one of our kind of multi-skilled people involved in this, Angela Bruckner, who many of you will have seen, has been organising much of the activity around SPIPA, has been really the main person carrying the project from day to day for the last several months, but as well as being a master manager and organizer of these kinds of events and activities and keeping things on track. She's also a researcher with backgrounds in a whole range of things, including in finance and in environment, and is so beautifully placed to look at questions around sustainable finance and various aspects of how they touch on climate. And so she's going to present a reasonably small research project that she's been looking at some of the comparisons between the EU and Australia in that topic. So with no further ado, I'll get on mute, and off video, and hand over to you, Angela.
Thanks very much, Peter. Really appreciate it. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. If not, please do give me a wave. My internet is notoriously dodgy. And like Belle, I'm relying on the square box in the lounge room to keep my 7-year-old occupied, so I may also end up being interrupted. So I'm going to start by giving a very brief and extremely high-level overview of something called the EU Taxonomy for Sustainable Activities. So at its heart, the EU Taxonomy is a classification system for environmentally sustainable economic activities. And so this is really important because a consistent framework for classifying green or sustainable assets or investments helps to protect investors from greenwashing. It provides some guideposts for companies that are trying to be more climate or environmentally friendly, and it helps to shift large-scale capital investment towards sustainable activities, which is what ultimately we're aiming to do. So the EU's taxonomy is one of several tools that has been put in place as part of the Green New Deal, and this includes some reporting and disclosure frameworks. And as part of these measures, applying the taxonomy is now mandatory as of the start of this year for large public interest companies operating in the EU, as well as banks and credit institutions. So at the moment, it's mandatory for about 12,000 institutions in the EU. It can also be used voluntarily by other market participants to either attract green investment if they're a company, or to screen their investments if they're an asset manager who's seeking to be more sustainable. So for an activity to be considered environmentally sustainable or taxonomy aligned, it has to meet 4 conditions. Firstly, it has to make a substantial contribution to at least one of 6 identified environmental objectives, and it also can't do any significant harm to any of the other objectives. And so to determine whether or not an activity makes a substantial contribution or does significant harm, it needs to comply with a set of what's called technical screening criteria that have been developed for each activity. It also has to comply with minimum social safeguards, which essentially covers human rights and labour right conventions. The 6 environmental objectives that the taxonomy is aiming to work towards are climate mitigation and adaptation, sustainability of water resources, protection and restoration of ecosystems and biodiversity, pollution prevention and control, and transitioning towards a circular economy. Of these, there's currently technical screening criteria in place for the climate mitigation and adaptation objectives, with a couple of sectors currently excluded, and I'll come to one of them in a moment. There's also draft technical screening criteria that have been developed for the remaining objectives, but only for particular sectors and activities. And the taxonomy is intended to be a living system that grows over time, which will include reviewing these criteria as technology and practices change. Next slide, please. So for this project, we zoomed in a bit on 2 particular sectors, and the first of which is agriculture. So agriculture represents about 12% of global emissions, and the majority of this, as you would expect, relates to animal agriculture, so particularly gases from digestive processes and management of manure. Looking at a regional level, agriculture represents a similar proportion of emissions for the EU specifically, but an outsized proportion of emissions in Australia, and that's in large part because we also include, or it includes the practice of savanna burning, which in Australia we do as prescribed burning to prevent later season bushfires. So that gets classified under agriculture in the particular data set that I was looking at. So I noted a few moments ago that there were some key sectors I excluded from the taxonomy, and agriculture is one of them. It's definitely had a bit of a journey. The initial drafts of the technical screening criteria in 2019 and early 2020 included 3 key criteria for agriculture, and these were broadly the reduction or avoidance of greenhouse gas emissions, practicing sustainable farm management processes, and a requirement that any land being farmed on hadn't been converted within the last 14 or so years, since 2008, from land that had been classified as having a high environmental value at any point during that time. So this is things with high conservation value like wetlands. So the draft regulation that was circulated for comment in November 2020 was similar, but had removed the greenhouse gas reduction and avoidance as a criteria. And then the final version that has now entered into law doesn't actually consider agriculture at all. So there's a couple of reasons for its exclusion. The EU has just completed some fairly significant reforms to its common agricultural policy, and this will ultimately influence the development of technical screening criteria to ensure alignment between the policies. There's also been a few political decisions or disagreements, and they're largely the ones that you would expect. So whether or not livestock should be included in any way, whether crops from biofuels should be included. And the EU also has an agricultural subsidies program called eco schemes, and there's been some discussion about whether these would be automatically eligible and whether that makes for a level playing ground with other farms that might not be aligned with those schemes but have similar practices. Agriculture is also a bit tricky because there's significant cultural barriers like a resistance to dietary change, and in some ways the societal discussion about transition to more sustainable and climate-friendly agriculture is a bit less mature than some of the comparable discussions in sectors like energy, where the need for transition is really well recognised. So for the other environmental objectives, the Platform on Sustainable Finance, which is a body that advises the EU Commission on a raft of different environmental and finance-based policy, including the technical screening criteria, they've identified that agriculture can make a significant contribution to biodiversity and ecosystem protection, sustainable use of water and pollution reduction, and they've developed draft screening criteria for biodiversity protection. Next slide, please, Win. So transport is the other sector that we looked at, and it's also a high emitting sector, which covers about 17% of global emissions if you exclude international shipping and aviation, or almost 20% if you do include them. And so this time it's the EU that has a somewhat higher proportion of transport-related emissions, and that's particularly emissions from light vehicles. Similar to agriculture, there's been several revisions through the development process, but not quite as dramatic as for agriculture. So the early drafts included passenger transport and freight transport, both on land and on inland waterways, and related low carbon infrastructure, but did not include marine shipping or aviation. By the time that November 2020 draft regulation was released, it had been expanded to cover some marine activities on a transitional basis. So the technical screening criteria for climate mitigation for the transport sector are largely based on vehicles having zero tailpipe emissions, although some vehicles like hybrid vehicles that meet particular emission standards are also included on a transition basis until 2025, as are some ships that meet particular energy efficiency standards. If you are using a zero emission heavy vehicle to move fossil fuels, your eligibility goes out the window. They are specifically excluded, which I think is a very sensible exclusion in terms of that aim of not permitting greenwashing. From a policy perspective, setting it as being a zero tailpipe emission model doesn't prioritise public transport or active transport only over individual car ownership, but it is possible that a life cycle model might eventually come into effect, which would be likely to push investment towards mass transit and away from private cars. Similarly to agriculture, the platform found that transport can make a significant contribution as well to biodiversity and ecosystem protection, use of water and pollution reduction. And there are draft technical screening criteria for pollution prevention and control, as well as some draft mitigation criteria for aviation, noting that zero emission aviation is a long way away, especially for long haul passengers. So one limitation of the technical screening criteria across the board, but particularly for transport, is that it relies on economic activity codes, in the EU's case, the NACE codes. And there's no codes for things like demand management or behaviour change or reducing demand of a particular activity. So these solutions aren't currently recognised in the taxonomy. So this is all really interesting, but what does it have to do with Australia? Next slide, please. The reason it's relevant to us is because we are also in Australia in the early stages of developing a taxonomy ourselves. This is being led by the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute, or formerly the Australian Sustainable Finance Initiative, which is an organisation that includes our financial institutions such as banks, super funds, insurers, peak bodies, and a few others. It's also got observers from the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, which regulates the banks, the Australian Securities and Investment Commission, which regulates companies and company directors, and also from the UN Environment Programme Finance Initiative. So during 2020, while we were all coming to grips with homeschooling and sourdough starters, ASFI were really busy developing a really comprehensive roadmap for sustainable finance in Australia, which included 37 recommendations across the 4 broad domains of embedding sustainability in leadership, integrating sustainability into practice, enabling resilience, and building sustainable finance markets. These recommendations are accompanied by an action plan with different actions in the short, medium, and long term out to 2030. So recommendation number 9 is exploring the possible development of a sustainable finance taxonomy. And the aim of this project is to be completed over the medium term, so by around 2025 or 2026. Next slide, please, Win. So before the development of an Australian taxonomy commences, there's a few differences between the EU taxonomy and the proposed Australian taxonomy. And the key difference is that the EU taxonomy is based in legislation as part of a full suite of policies and regulations, whereas the Australian taxonomy, as currently envisioned, would be a voluntary industry-led initiative. So that means that for the EU taxonomy, a lot of the high-level goals of the taxonomy were already really well defined by the other surrounding policies. So for a new industry-led initiative, these will need to be determined at the outset. It also changes who is making the decisions. So for the EU taxonomy, this is the EU Commission with input from the Platform on Sustainable Finance that I mentioned earlier. They're a relatively small group of experts, including some representatives from the EU institutions, financial services, corporates, NGOs, and some other independent experts. And this supersedes a similar group, which was the technical expert group, which was slightly smaller and had a somewhat heavier focus on the finance sector. So there's an argument as to whether or not you keep these groups small or large. An argument for keeping them small is that the more people you have in the group, the harder it is to reach a consensus on or set parameters for the taxonomy and its structures. But on the other hand, a smaller group also means that you're reaching a smaller number of market participants. And one of the criticisms of the technical expert group was that it had very little connection with industries outside of finance. Having said that, when you open it up to include polluting sectors, you start looking at vested interests coming in. And in particular, there's a real discrepancy between investors who are looking for genuinely sustainable investment standards versus companies that want to be recognised as sustainable for doing quite a bit less and at a much lower benchmark. So one member of the platform told us that all of the differences of opinion, once they did start getting those sorts of stakeholders on board, were the really predictable ones, depending on the interests of the members involved. And we saw that with agriculture. as well. So given that the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute is predominantly a finance-based group, how and when to engage with other sectors will be a key question. There's also the question of how decisions are made within the group. So the EU's platform is consensus-based, but does allow minority reports, and contested positions have to present evidence, but that means that there also has to be a mechanism for recognising where both sides present quality information that may be contradictory through things like different regional contexts. Alternatively, Australia might go with a different decision-making model or advisory model, such as majority rules, and then you just need to understand how you're going to, whether you're going to enforce a majority rule on everybody. Once the overarching goals are set, there's a lot of technical decisions to be made. So which environmental goals should be targeted? So for the EU, that's the 6 that I mentioned earlier. Australia may choose to use different goals. It may choose to align somewhat to those goals. It may only focus on climate mitigation for the moment or something like that. So that will be a technical question to come to. Who the primary users of the taxonomy are and how it should be used. So again, in the EU, it's mandatory for a certain number of companies. It's unlikely to be the case that it will be mandatory in Australia, given that it's an industry-led and voluntary initiative, but certainly some guidance on how it's expected to be used, whether there are particular entities that the regulators may want to see using this, even if it's not mandatory. So that's all to be developed as well. Another question is which sectors should be covered. And as we've seen earlier, that's not necessarily straightforward. You can't necessarily cover the entire economy. And depending on which environmental goals you set, it's actually quite tricky coming up with these technical screening criteria, as the science might not be as well developed. Another question is which methodological concepts should be used. So for the EU taxonomy, these are things mentioned earlier, like substantial contribution and do no significant harm. Another question is whether these should be science-based, which the EU taxonomy aims to be, or whether they should consider broader policy objectives. So an example here is another fairly well-developed taxonomy-like tool, which is China's Green Bond Catalogue. And it allows clean coal because the policy objective there says, well, we're working on air quality, climate mitigation is not as important. So having those sorts of decisions made at the outset of what's the basis for a criteria being entered into the taxonomy will be really important. Should the taxonomy only include sectors that are either already green or that can clean up their act, or should it also include things like low impact activities? So this is an active question at the moment in the case of the EU taxonomy, which is considering broadening it to both low impact activities that don't really, things like your health and education that don't necessarily have much of an environmental impact. They're also working on a draft of a social taxonomy, which I believe is being presented next week, which would also direct investment towards social goals beyond sustainable goals. Another question is how transition activities should be covered. And again, this has been a really live and very controversial issue recently in the EU, particularly regarding the inclusion of nuclear and gas-fired power in the taxonomy. And I could probably spend easily another 20 minutes talking about that, so I won't get started. There's also the question about how the taxonomy should interact with other policies. And again, agriculture and the issues with getting agriculture into the taxonomy has been a good example of this. Another example is in shipping, which is currently also working on mandatory fuel blending standards under the Fit for 55 policy. So it's not directly relevant to the taxonomy, but it shows that this is a really complex area for many sectors with competing policies and priorities, even for companies and investors that are really trying to do the right thing and trying to badge themselves as green or sustainable. So those are sort of the taxonomy development questions. There's one more, which is whether or not the Australian taxonomy should align to the EU taxonomy, and if so, to what extent. So one benefit of aligning the taxonomies is that it creates a really clear set of guidance for investors who usually operate globally. So anything that minimises the number of different sets of rules and frameworks that apply from their perspective is probably a really good idea. And on that point, it's really worth noting that the EU has tried to draft their taxonomy with the expectation that other markets and other companies would potentially seek to align with the taxonomy to attract European investment. And there's some evidence that this is already happening. Alternatively, it might be the case that the developers of the Australian taxonomy think that we've got some really important regional differences or different environmental priorities, so may not want to align as closely. So there's a couple of different options there. One is to partially align on a concept basis. So using similar ideas of do no significant harm and substantial contribution. But there's also another 20 or so different taxonomies in development around the world at various stages. And so another example might be that, similar to what the EU and China have recently done, is once a taxonomy is developed for Australia, we could map some of the different concepts and definitions between the two frameworks to assist investors that are working across both sets. So they're pretty much it for the choices and I guess some of the questions that arise out of the EU taxonomy for Australia. But there's also one really key lesson from the EU, which has been mentioned by several of the people we've spoken to. And that is that it's really, really important to know what the taxonomy is, but it's equally important to be really clear, especially when communicating with external stakeholders in non-finance industries about what it isn't. And in particular, there were a lot of misconceptions. The EU taxonomy meant that you couldn't invest in assets that aren't taxonomy aligned, which is not the case at all. You can still invest in coal if you want to. It's just not going to be labelled as sustainable under this particular framework. Having said that, the one final point that I would make is that a really common thread through all of the different investor and sectoral perspectives is that the purpose and the intention of the EU taxonomy is recognised as being a really important part of a sustainable financial system, which is really positive both for the EU taxonomy and also for the adoption of taxonomies in other jurisdictions. So that was about all I had, and I can see that quite a few questions have come through. So I'll probably just moderate those myself. So Jordan has said that the term sustainable is really overused, and yes, that is definitely a challenge, and that I think is why the EU has taken this effort of making I guess their definition of what is sustainable for each asset and which activity really clear. Whether or not everyone agrees that that is sustainable is another question. And again, this comes back to that nuclear and gas discussion. Let's see, so I'm just scrolling through the questions. While I'm doing that, Peter, did you have any? Because I know you like to take the host privilege.
I did actually, a bunch, probably like everybody else. This is really intriguing for me. I kept trying to imagine what this would look like in Australia. What would happen if you had something on preservation of water, for example, that didn't have a community aspect in the taxonomy, that didn't have a do no harm to local agricultural communities. Given the politics around water in Australia, I can imagine the politics around climate being exactly the same. I was really interested to find that the EU had separated the environmental and social taxonomies. And do you know, did you get a sense from people around how much of a fight there'd been around that kind of thing? I could imagine, I certainly know what the Australian case would be, but I'd be interested to know what happened in Europe.
Not as much. I don't think water in particular is as contested.
Yep.
Whereas obviously, particularly sort of down our east coast, the Murray-Darling Basin, whatever, water all the way from Queensland through to South Australia is very, very contested in Australia. I don't know that I've really sort of picked up on there being too much of a question around that from Europe, but I think that would definitely be a geographic difference in context that would need to be considered.
Yeah, I could certainly imagine that if there was a push to do an environmental taxonomy separate from social considerations, that would be an energetic debate in Australia, I might say.
Absolutely, and like I said, the draft that the platform on sustainable finance has developed is, I think, being launched on Monday. So it'll be really interesting to see what they've included in that, and how it interacts with the taxonomy that exists at the moment. If they're basing it on green bond standards or social bond standards, which is generally considered to be the starting point for the taxonomy, then it might not necessarily include doing no significant harm to communities. It's more likely the case that it will be trying to target investment towards social policy goals.
Right.
And so that's usually development of education, of health, affordable housing, that sort of thing. But there might not necessarily be that sort of linkage between climate mitigation, but in a way that does no harm to a community.
Yeah.
So that's a really interesting point, and potentially a gap in the taxonomy. Yeah.
I think we got quite an interesting questions coming from David about bankable sustainable investment. The taxonomy of the do you see with the taxonomy, it will help, to classify, which investment is sustainable or not sustainable?
Yeah, and look,
in terms of investment.
Yeah, that's certainly the aim. And one of the issues, I guess, and this is a bit where the sort of misconception came up about, oh, we won't be allowed to finance or invest in anything bad, is that there's this misconception, I think, that there's a massive amount of green funding flying around. It's actually representing a really small proportion at the moment of global capital funds. I think it's something to the tune of between 1% and 2% are identified as being green or sustainable. So being able to increase the amount of bankably sustainable investment, I absolutely agree. But the key there will be making sure that the taxonomy is rigorous. And I think, again, I'm not going to get too much into it in the interest of time, but that's where things like the inclusion of nuclear and gas and some of these questions around agriculture possibly do that a little bit of detriment, because if there's too many political compromises on what's considered sustainable, then the greenwashing is in the building. It's so they really do need to be rigorous standards if they're going to be applied meaningfully. So yeah, no, really good question. So hopefully, yes, it will fund more sustainable investment in infrastructure and real estate, but certainly that will depend on how rigorous the standards are.
If there's one more question, sorry, Angela, go on.
Sorry, David's just dropped in the chat that Morningstar removed 12,000 funds totaling assets of 1.4 trillion from its European sustainable list after review of disclosures due to greenwashing. I would absolutely believe it. So yes, having a rigorous framework to determine what is actually sustainable and what's greenwashing is super important to drive investment in this space. And I'm sorry, I know that Jordan and David have got a couple of other questions. I don't have a view on green ammonia, David. I actually don't know enough about it, but if it works, that would be brilliant. I don't know that it's been considered at this stage in the taxonomy, but certainly I would imagine it's under active consideration. But I unfortunately do need to wrap up to go and child wrangle. So.
All right, thank you very much. That was a fantastic talk. It's actually something I'll be really interested to follow. That it's one of these cases where the similarities and differences with the EU are going to be really interesting. So I think the way various environmental policies have played out and perhaps need to play out in Australia is going to be quite different. And some of the structures of the taxonomy probably represent the structures of European governance, of the way some things get sliced in Europe differently than they get sliced here. And it's going to be really interesting to see how this looks, and particularly also how the government responds. How is this thing going to get projected into policy? Is it going to get taken up in any form beyond just a self-regulatory or self-descriptive code for the finance industry?
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, the Council of Financial Regulators, so that includes APRA and ASIC, are very interested in it, but that doesn't necessarily translate to the political space. So it will depend very much on next developments there.
Great, really cool. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to suggest we take a short break and that we come back at, what's the time now? It's just about 17 past. So I'm going to suggest we do come back at 6:25 as we've suggested, and we're going to move into some discussions of some links around aspects of the program, and then kind of think about the way forward. I'm going to make some comments on things I think we've learned and what we might do next. So hopefully see a few of you after the break in about 8 minutes. Now we're recording again. No, I will start again. So welcome back, everyone. I hope people managed to get a short break and get back in time for, as I said, the last section of this wrap up, where we'll talk through links to other projects, and then a couple of comments on what I think are general lessons and next steps. And then I'll make a couple of acknowledgements at the end about a few people who have been really valuable to this project throughout. So it's really important to note that the knowledge network that we've been talking about for the last 3 days and the research activities it's involved in is, as Scott pointed out, for those of you who are here on Tuesday back at the beginning, this is by no means the only activity that SPIPA has been involved in Australia. And the major one that we've had connection with is an action more focused around networks around business. And that's been led by Climate Kick in Australia. And I think I'll leave it to Marion Schön, who is kind of been in charge of that activity here and who I also know from activities around the University of Melbourne. I'll leave it to Marion, I think, to introduce that. So Marion, if you'd like to come to the fore, I'll get off video and off on mute and let you talk a little bit about the kind of connections more broadly in the SPIPA project.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Win. I'll let you know when to move. So thank you, Peter, and delighted to be joining you today to sort of think a little bit about, the learnings from the across programs and within programs and potentially what might be useful for the future. And I'd also like to acknowledge my EU colleagues, particularly given the events that are unfolding in Europe at the moment. So I might just go back a little bit. So as Peter mentioned, the European Union Australian Climate Business Network, and I'll refer to that as the network from now on, was also supported under the SPIPA program. And the main delivery partner for that project was, of course, Climate Kick Australia. So we commenced our work in about mid-2019 with some sectoral mapping and starting to engage with the European industry. And then during early 2020, we started engaging with Australia, but of course, that was a bit of a challenge in the early days of the pandemic during 2020. And so a lot of our activities has taken place in the last sort of 18 months. Wynne, could you just move to the next slide, please? Next, thank you. So we were tasked with fostering public awareness within the business community, as just one back, please, sorry. Within the business community around the challenges and opportunities presented by the Paris Agreement. And the objective there was to inform industry practice and also policy advocacy across a range of industry sectors. The industry sectors that we supported outreach for were 12 sectors ranging from renewable energy, finance and investment, insurance, waste management, building, the built environment and major infrastructure. So basically most of the economy, we did not focus on mining, so that was one thing. And the idea was that we would share policy and industry practice, not only through connecting the industry associations with their comparators in Europe, but also to facilitate opportunities at workshops, etc., to share some of those experiences. We had a particular focus around climate and trade, given that the network was being established against the background of the EU-Australia free trade negotiations, which are still ongoing and I suspect may be concluded sometime this year. So here is just some of the organisations that we collaborated with, mostly during the last 18 months after all the various lockdowns ended. So the Ocean Energy Group was a major focus, looking at the development of an offshore renewables policy framework in Australia, which was finally put in place last year. We connected them up with the European marine energy organisations, including the Dutch Marine Energy Centre and some of the peak bodies. And that involved sharing industry experience around putting in place projects and also market development around particularly ocean energy as part of integrated energy systems. There was also a focus increasingly around the role of offshore renewables, including marine energy, to support the hydrogen industry. So that's obviously something in Europe that has been a topic of conversation for a number of years, but increasingly also in Australia. We also connected up the built environment through our collaboration with the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council and linking them to European organisations like Renovate Europe, the campaign for energy efficiency in buildings, and also the Building Performance Institute of Europe, a major think tank. And so part of that was bringing some of the senior people in those organisations to present to people like the Australian Built Environment Council, which is comprised of 70 of the major peak bodies in the built environment. We also had a substantial number of events around circular economy and resource recovery. So linking up the Waste Management and Resource Recovery Association with some of the European equivalents, the European Resource Industry Confederation, and also the organisation that is involved in waste to energy industry. And reflecting some of the work that Angela's done, we also had a substantial part of our project last year was involved with on sustainable finance and linking up with the Australian Sustainable Finance Initiative, and I'll say a bit more about that shortly. So we also looked at the hydrogen sector, so with the German Chamber of Commerce, and presented a comparative analysis of the development of hydrogen clusters with the Hunter Valley Hydrogen Hub here in Australia. So our approach was to work with the EU ecosystem. So that included not only the chambers, connections with embassy, and of course the EU delegation here in Canberra, and also companies are involved. So next slide, please. Next slide, Win. So as I mentioned, a major focus was trade and sustainable development. The EU, as you'd probably be aware, has been instrumental in driving climate progress through some of the high standards it's set through its FTAs, and that includes chapters around trade and sustainable development. So we collaborated with two industry bodies here, the European Australian Business Council and also the Professionals in Trade Network, to present some events around one of the key policy developments last year, in addition to the EU's own revised trade policy, which was the carbon border adjustment, which elicited a lot of industry interest. We had a very high-level panel from not only government, but also senior industry representatives to really start considering what the implications of that was for Australia. We've also been looking at the role of sustainable trade finance in terms of the instruments required to support trade and how that links with the sustainable finance sector. Next slide, Win. And as I mentioned, the sustainable finance theme was a major area of focus. It's a critical enabler for climate transition, and we facilitated as part of this project some exchanges between the EU and Australian finance and investment sector. And the objective here was to share knowledge on the implementation of financial system frameworks, the kind of detail that Angela presented earlier. And part of the reason for that was to build capacity in the Australian market and also momentum for the implementation of the ASFI roadmap. So we held a number of technical workshops on that theme, looking at the taxonomy in practice and how that is going to be implemented. We looked at the supervisory and regulatory approaches to climate risk by the European supervisory agencies and the Australian Council for Financial Regulators. And that's already evolved into a commitment to further the conversation and have sort of further peer-to-peer events. And a significant development late last year was the focus around nature-related financial disclosures. So significant interest in the local industry and banking sector here, which I think will be the basis for further priority activities of ASFI sometime next year. We held, particularly for this audience, a University Research Roundtable, which provided some really constructive understanding around the types of research being undertaken that relate to sustainable finance. And the objective there was to bridge the gap between practice and research. And certainly there was good involvement from the University of Melbourne and hopefully some potential for future engagement with the ASFI members as part of research. And then in addition to that, we also had a major public event last year around mid-November after COP26, which presented on the implications for the Australian finance sector of not only COP26, but a lot of the other global governance frameworks around sustainable finance. And for that event, we had representation from the British High Commission as the host for COP26, as well as the Australian Ambassador for the Environment and a representative from the EU, from the Director General for Financial Services, which handles sustainable finance, and also representatives from some of the major finance sector bodies. So all of the events have been seen as being very valuable to start developing understanding within the Australian finance and investment sector about the implications for Australia as the start of starting to consider, what might a taxonomy in Australia look like. Next page. Win, next slide. So reflecting on all of those activities over the last year, we're starting to give some thought as to what we might focus on for the future to sort of build on the legacy of the time we've had to establish the network. I think some of the feedback I've had and some of my own sort of learnings have been that to have more impact, both at industry and policy level, a deeper focus on sectoral policy frameworks and regulation would be of use, particularly, for example, in areas like offshore renewables, where some of those policy frameworks are just in the process of being developed, and there are certainly lots of things that we could have from the European experience. For those kind of sectors, there is now an increased focus on project development, so some of the underlying conditions that are required, so things around risk insurance and also financing for project development. We've had feedback that further deeper engagement with Europe would be very useful to provide case studies, particularly in the area of sustainable finance, and also to develop further knowledge products through the development of policy briefings or implementation guides or training opportunities for the finance sector. And then I would also suggest that sustainable trade is a focus for activities for the network, potentially given that the free trade agreement is likely to be concluded, potentially in the next year. So that's just a bit of sort of some background on the activities that we've undertaken over the last 2 or so years, some of our learnings and thinking about where that might go into the future. And I very much look forward to sharing that with Peter and also collaborating with the Knowledge Network as that develops. Thank you.
Thanks, Marion. That's an admirable depth of activity for what was actually a reasonably small project, and you managed to really leverage a very strong and diverse network across there. I guess it must have felt a bit like herding cats, I suspect, at various stages.
It did.
And congratulations doing that through the pandemic as well. Really interesting, I think. I don't know were there any questions sitting in the Q&A for that. It's almost a very natural segue into my wrap up, I guess, around our lessons, learnings and regrets from the Knowledge Network. But if there are any questions for Marion before we do that.
I hope so, but that's not yet coming.
Yep. Well, why don't we pass over then as almost a parallel presentation to the last couple of slides for Marion about things that we think that we've learned, and learnings are generally lessons, and lessons are often things that you wish you'd done better in my case. So let's talk a bit about that. So if we can move to that slide on overall lessons. Let me get my own house in order here. So a few things that I think I've learned about this. One of them I think has been learned by hundreds of millions of people around the world, which is don't do network intensive activities in the middle of a pandemic, right? Who knew? It has been, although what has been interesting to me, I think, about this has been what's possible, the kind of flexibility and resilience that everyone has shown to make this work in a useful way under these rather strange set of circumstances. And we've probably, as in many other things, come away with a series of techniques and levels of comfort that'll make this kind of networks easier in future. We're all better at Zoom than we used to be. We don't necessarily like it anymore, but we're certainly better at it. I think the other thing that we were very lucky to be able to do in this knowledge network was to build on what's there. The attendance we were getting at seminars and so on, and activities through the early days of the activity in particular, were built really strongly on the years of effort and success of the Climate and Energy College, now part of Melbourne Climate Futures, that had a really positive, high-profile external seminar series for years, and we're able to leverage off that set of connections and that visibility, and use the dissemination mechanisms there to really make a flying start. Much harder to do this stuff from scratch, and in general, there's quite a bit of activity in this area. So any building activity that we do in future around networks really should start with what's there, I think. There are risks in doing that, about lock-ins and clubs and so on. We've got to be careful about that, but it's hard to do this stuff from scratch. It was interesting for us, for me at least, to know what was easy and what was hard. Researcher to researcher links were pretty easy. because we kind of know who's writing what, and in general, we've got some sense around most of the major institutions, at least in similar kinds of industries to ourselves, around higher education, around government agencies and so on. For those who've been here for the last couple of days, the links that we formed between the University of Melbourne and ECHO in Berlin were phenomenal. That was a partnership that really blossomed out of this network, and looks like it's going to bear a whole stack of fruit for the institutes involved, and probably more broadly into the future. Broader kinds of links are harder. The kinds of the leverage, the access we're able to get from asking our country liaison group, for example, in the Commission, who in the Commission do I talk to about X, is stuff that we would have found it very hard to do cold as researchers from the outside. So having even the existence of links into the Commission and into the kind of policymaking apparatus in both jurisdictions has been really powerful. And I'd actually, in future, think it would be quite interesting to see what links we could build into the Australian government side as well, at least on the kind of technical end, understanding the policy and political constraints are going too far in that direction. But I think there are really powerful capabilities that one gets if one enforces a link between researchers and kind of the knowledge industry and the policy apparatus more directly. One of the lessons we get to learn, it's been my experience in the past from networking activities, that really good links survive the end of the funding. And we don't know yet whether that's going to happen. That's one of my measures of success, where the people who have started working together want to keep working together even when the money's gone. And that's going to be, I think that's kind of, we won't know that for a little while. There are clearly a bunch of projects in play and underway that I think will continue, but what kind of happens organically past the building of the end of the network. There's probably a whole stack of others. I mean, there's obviously, one learns all the time about how project management and so on works, but I think about how these networks work. My overall take is there is a strong set of networks. The networks from researchers to researchers are strong. Building those links back into decision makers, either in business or in policy, is something that is a permanent work in progress, because decision makers in both those places keep changing, and their priorities and so on keep changing. But I think projects like this that actually have the oversight structure that we had via the country liaison group back into various organisms within Europe actually gave us a way of accessing things that we couldn't access otherwise. And I also want to thank that group, the country liaison group, who've kind of overseen the project for being not just really understanding, well-organized, thoughtful interlocutors for the project, but also being conduits, access for us into other parts of Europe in particular. We're probably down to a small enough group now that if people just want to unmute and ask questions or comments, that's perfectly fine. We're moving into an almost discussion here for the last few minutes. So if there's anyone particularly involved around the edges of the project who'd like to make a comment on what I've just said, you're most welcome. Before I make a comment on next steps and a few acknowledgements. So we're moving into a bit more of a free-for-all here.
You guys can click raise hand, can use the raise hand function so that I can see if you want to ask the questions in person.
Yeah,
please.
That's right, I forget this is a webinar, not a conventional Zoom meeting. So non-presenters aren't naturally unmuted. People are comfortable?
I think, I mean, Peter, I can just add a few other learnings around developing a network, if that's useful while people are thinking.
Yeah.
I think, you know, apart from trying to do this in a pandemic when certainly industry Australia was worried about its own survival and its workforce and not very focused on policy developments except the one at the next budget, I think certainly we've found it easier once sort of there were more federal government policies being announced that people could you know, look at and say, well, you know, some of this is already happening in Europe, perhaps we could learn from that. I think one of the challenges around a network is you've got to provide value. People in industry are not going to just engage because it's interesting. They want to have something that's actually related to their particular policy focus or, you know, areas where their members have an interest. So I think that's, you know, that's always something to keep in mind in terms of engaging with industry. Some of our industry associations are very small. You know, they're often sometimes 2 or 3 people. You know, they have a lot on their plate. So, you know, for another group to come in and suggest that, you know, they want to engage with a whole lot of other people can often be, you know, be too much of a load for them. So I think, you know, that's something we've found. So to sort of really understand what the strategic area of interest was around a particular policy issue certainly, you know, generated sort of greater commitment and interest in engaging.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Academics will probably tend to network for its own sake because we'll learn something by accident and other people don't have the time to learn things by
that's
accident.
Right. It's more a serendipitous experience, which let me tell you, industry is not quite like that.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. Let me then make a couple of comments on next steps. I commented that the good networks survive beyond the end of the money, and let's see what happens here. So let's move to the slide on next steps, When. Firstly, we're pretty sure that the seminar series that kind of SPIPA really helped support and grow over the last few months will survive. The Melbourne Climate Futures at least is deeply interested in maintaining the kind of momentum of a significant seminar series with significant profile doing important things. And there's almost a segue to that. There's a couple more seminars that SPIPA has actually supported that are going beyond the formal end of the project, which is next week. And we'll see actually an upcoming couple of extra seminars announced at the end of this. But one of them is going to be talking very directly about climate policy stances, positions that we think we understand of the parties going into the next federal election. And that's a topic that's naturally going to draw quite a bit of interest. It's a perfectly legitimate topic for us to be discussing, and you know, it's a kind of marker, I guess, that we'll be staying active in this space. One of the lessons that I didn't comment on last time, I thought about it as a next step, really, is I'd like to encourage us to think a little more multilaterally and regionally. The structure of the SPIPA project was pretty much a hub and spoke arrangement. And that was fine at a time when it was formed. That was necessary. It was really important that we maintained what momentum there was around climate action after Paris and what was proving to be a politically difficult period. But that's changing. And I think it's now pretty important that we can start to encourage multilateral relationships. We'd certainly be interested in seeing what common areas of activity and interest there could be between, say, Europe, Australia, and some of our regional neighbours. There's clearly some shared interest. There's a whole range of geopolitical as well as environmental reasons why we might want to start to collaborate. And I think that's an option we could take up in the environmental space a bit more strongly than we are at the moment. One of the tasks we were given in SPIPA was to think about what we could do to make this network sustainable. And so quite early on, once we were involved in the project, we started to discuss from a university perspective what we thought we could do to build sustainable networks that were covering much of the same ground as SPIPA, the non-government organisations, the not-for-profits, the higher education sector, and so on. And indeed, there are activities that we're trying to develop, and certainly not alone, but around thinking about what's the right leadership for this. Is there a place for a university-led network, a university-organised and centred network, but by no means restricted to the higher education sector? And those discussions are ongoing. They'll be complicated. There'll be the usual jostling for leadership if that's something actually like this grows legs and gets active. But there does seem to be interest from support and interest from leadership within the sector to make networks like the one SPIPA has been supporting in Australia continue. So I'm pretty optimistic that will happen. Those of you who were here on Tuesday might have noticed that Scott, at the very beginning of the project, mentioned SPIPA 2 and that we don't know much about it. And indeed, we don't yet. But it's clearly there's interest from Europe, in some kind of continuity around the activities, or at least around an activity in this direction, around continuing the strategic partnership. What that might look like, what's the best value proposition for the kind of activities that Europe would support, we don't know. And presumably the relevant bodies in Europe are thinking through that. But I hope that even if organizations like us who have been involved turn out not to be next time, there's at least some leveraging, and we would certainly stand ready to support whatever activities go forward if there are activities that are involving Australia for that, and we'd be happy to do that. That's kind of all I had about next steps. We would have been good to be able to talk a little more about the transition into whatever the next activity for SPIPA would be, but we just don't know enough about that yet, and that's fine. Before I give a couple of acknowledgements again, particularly if there are any members of the country liaison group on, if there are any kind of final comments that you'd like to make around after this wrap up, we'll be moving into a small meeting after this, but if there are comments you want to make to the wider group, feel free to do that. Otherwise, I'll now make a few acknowledgements and wrap up for the day. Anybody raising their hand, Win?
Yep, Alan Pierce. Alan, would you like to direct the questions to Peter? I'm sure you have the mic and all that. I can unmute you. Yep.
Okay.
Yep, we can hear you. It's good.
Yeah, hi, Peter. Yeah, I've actually been working with APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Community, and in fact, RMIT University in Melbourne has a centre which plays a key role there. And I must admit, my involvement there has been in the low carbon model towns program mainly, but I certainly think that the EU and SPIPA could potentially build some partnerships across the Asia Pacific region, because, well, certainly having done the project on building an appliance efficiency for this project, there's an awful lot in common with that and the low carbon model towns program I've been working on with APEC. And I think there's a lot of goodwill. I think the challenges are that we don't have enough money and resources to invest in the networking and the dialogue to build sort of genuine relationships between people where they sort of raise the priority of what these joint projects are to a point where they can overcome the overwhelming day-to-day pressures of academia and business. So I think we have to accept that, you know, things like this are competing in a very tough environment against literally survival stuff and, you know, delivering the increasing workloads of teaching and research within academia.
Yeah, absolutely. Money buys time and headspace, and both of those are expensive commodities in modern academia. That's a fair point. Mm-hmm. Any other comments?
Nope.
If not, I'm going to make a couple of acknowledgements when wrapping up, and I'm glad I managed to leave myself a couple of minutes to do this. I first want to acknowledge again the funding bodies, not just the fact that they gave us some money, which was great, but the fact that they were able to deal with this, but the fact that we had to keep revising this on the fly as things kept changing because we found that lots of things we wanted to do, we just couldn't. There are limitations on time, there are limitations obviously on the way we could structure the activities with the pandemic, and not everybody is flexible enough to respond to the kinds of changes that we had to make this work. I'd like to think it was quite successful in the end. We managed to push along some interesting, important research projects. I think we've got the basis for some important collaborations into the future, and I think the profile that we built for a range of the activities we've been involved in was very good. So I'd like to think it was a success, but it certainly wasn't the project that we initially envisaged. And thanks very much to GIZ, to the Commission, and so on for staying with us through those changes. I want to acknowledge the country liaison group themselves, who again were patient, flexible, and instructive, really informed, engaged in not just overseeing what we were doing, but passing on information. And it was great to have that access to be able to ask a question. Do you know somebody in country X working on Y? And know that, no, I don't, but she might. That kind of stuff worked really well for the networking. It was a fine example. Particularly want to thank Alessandro, our extremely patient kind of project officer for the project. Once again, the business of dealing with a bunch of scatterbrained academics like me and the exigencies of running a European project under the necessarily complicated rules that they have would have tested the patience of a saint. And thanks very much for that, for working with us. There's still wrap up to go. We'll be discussing that in a few minutes, but I think we managed to structure a decent project, and that's in no small part due to you. And I want to acknowledge the people leading the major research projects for the network. That's Alan and Rosalinda for the buildings project, and Sangeeta, Dylan, and Johanna and their respective teams for the Energy Affordability and Poverty project. Again, I think it's been a really fine example of how, with reasonably small kind of investment, we can bootstrap really interesting activities, which will probably continue. They'll probably continue to bear fruit after we're done. And last and most, I want to thank Angela, who's probably not on. She's probably off arranging things for the family, it being that time of night in Australia. The project, when she came on, really needed muscle. It needed somebody who could actually get stuff done. As Alan was commenting, I wasn't in a position really to do that day to day, there aren't enough hours in a day. It needed somebody who could actually really action a whole range of things. Angela did a fantastic job and managed to do some research on the way. An extraordinary achievement, really, while working around a family with COVID and all sorts of stuff that everyone was working through. So I'll make sure that this is recorded at least, and a really strong vote of thanks to Angela for making this work. And thanks to all of you for many of you for interest in a range of seminars over the length of the project. I don't know when. There's actually a slide with a couple of upcoming seminars. Not quite done yet. A couple of seminars have been pushed off the end just by illness from presenters and various things. We have a formal launch for the building and appliance efficiency report that we'll talk about. You'll see on the website fairly soon. And we have a couple of seminars that just slid off the end of the formal project. So we're not done. Feel free to turn up for those and keep a watch on pages like the Melbourne Climate Futures to see what we're doing into the future. And with that, and with the thanks to everyone, I think we can now wrap up.